Hello and welcome to part 2 of our quest to stop ourselves overreacting. In part 1, at the end of it, I suggested that there were times when we probably couldn't stop ourselves overreacting. I believe that to be the case, at least for most of us. It certainly is for me. And one of the main reasons that sometimes it is so difficult to stop ourselves overreacting is what we'll explore in part 2 right now. And as we explore that reason, or one of the reasons, in my opinion, the main reason, you may find that that can actually help us once we understand what's going on to, well, actually ultimately overreact less. Can't guarantee we're going to stop doing it entirely. That would be a heck of a claim. So let's continue. To help us do that, I'm going to access a couple of articles, links in the description. I won't go over every element of the articles, as I encourage you to give them a read yourself if you're interested. So you'll see here the title of this one is The 6 Major Theories of Emotion. Because emotion, or emotions, yes, that's the thing that can stop us from stopping ourselves overreacting. And although it says 6 major theories, I should add, some of these theories are kind of similar and you'll get the gist of it. So I'm not going to go over every single theory. Let's begin with an evolutionary theory. This suggests that emotions have an evolutionary origin, as you might have guessed. Charles Darwin proposed that emotions evolved because they were adaptive and allowed humans and animals to survive and reproduce. Feelings of love and affection lead people to seek mates and reproduce. Feelings of fear compel people to fight or flee the source of danger. That seems to be fair enough. So, okay, there's something about evolution. I'd go with that in terms of where emotions came from. Then we have the James Lange theory of emotion, one of the best known examples of a physiological theory of emotion, independently proposed by psychologist William James and physiologist Carl Lange. It suggests that emotions occur as a result of physiological reactions to events. According to that theory, an external stimulus leads to a physiological reaction. Your emotional reaction depends upon how you interpret those physical reactions. For example, suppose you are walking in the woods and see a grizzly bear. You begin to tremble and your heart begins to race. The James Lange theory proposes that you will conclude that you are frightened. I am trembling, therefore I am afraid. According to this theory of emotion, you're not trembling because you're frightened. Instead, you feel frightened because you're trembling. So I'll read that little bit halfway through again. I am trembling, therefore I am afraid. So it's how we interpret those physical reactions. Maybe. And then we have let's skip to here, the Schachter-Singer theory, also known as the two-factor theory of emotion. It's an example of a cognitive theory of emotion. This theory suggests that physiological arousal occurs first, and then the individual must identify the reason for this arousal to experience and label it as an emotion. A stimulus leads to a physiological response that is then cognitively interpreted and labelled, resulting in an emotion. Like the Cannon-Bard theory, the Schachter-Singer theory also suggests that similar physiological responses can produce varying emotions. For example, if you experience a racing heart and sweating palms during an important exam, you will probably identify the emotion as anxiety. If you experience the same physical responses on a date, you might interpret those responses as love, affection, or arousal. And I've read from that particular part of the article, the Cannon-Bard theory, which I haven't covered because it is similar to Schachter-Singer, and they both kind of disagree with the James Lange theory. So let's then move on. Cognitive appraisal theory. According to appraisal theories of emotion, thinking must occur first before experiencing emotion. Richard Lazarus was a pioneer in this area of emotion, and this theory is often referred to as the Lazarus theory of emotion. The cognitive appraisal theory asserts that your brain first appraises a situation, and the resulting response is an emotion. According to this theory, the sequence of events first follows a stimulus, followed by a thought, which then leads to the simultaneous experience of a physiological response and the emotion. For example, if you encounter a bear in the woods, you might immediately begin to think that you are in great danger. This then leads to the emotional experience of fear and the physical reactions associated with the fight or flight response. And yeah, these theories to me are all quite similar. They're quite plausible in their own different ways, and yet I don't think that one of them, in my opinion, absolutely accurately describes what's going on. And we need to have some kind of model, I believe, or framework to help us think about things in the moment. If emotions are the issue, as I'm suggesting that they are, if we are ever going to stop ourselves overreacting, then maybe something more, let's say, easy to grasp, conceptual, a framework, yeah, but simple. That's what I like, at least, because I'm quite simple. And before we get there, let's look at this to further confuse, well, not exactly, but to show that there's no consensus out there. So this is from this article, Basic Emotions in Human Neuroscience, Neuroimaging and Beyond. For example, in the 1980s, Fair and Russell, 1984, wrote that everyone knows what an emotion is until asked to give them a definition. Then it seems no one knows. That's great, because this is what I found. That sums it up. Oh, do you know what an emotion is? Yeah. Well, okay, give us a definition. Then it gets a bit more complicated. So the article goes on. Kleingina and Kleingina, 821, considered 92 definitions and 9 skeptical descriptions produced by scientists in the field, which effectively represent the lack of consensus with regard to the characteristics that define the concept of emotion and its usefulness in a scientific framework. Besides specific differences, supporters of the existence of basic emotions, such as Ekman, Tompkins, Izzard, Plutchik, Levinson and Panksepp, share some fundamental assumptions derived from an evolutionistic Darwinian approach. And the idea of basic emotions, if we look at, say, Ekman, for example, this is suggesting that, well, let's take fear. Fear, you can't really parse it out. If you change it to anxiety, it's not fear. And you can't go any deeper than fear. You can say big fear, more fear, but fear, according to Ekman and others, is a basic emotion. And you may get variations of that which are connected and more subtle. Anyway, this approach suggests that emotions have developed and got selected because of their adaptive value, meaning that through some automatic mechanisms, they are capable of regulating the interaction with the proximal environment, what's around us close by, while at the same time providing effective responses, both instrumental and communicative, in relation to the relevant situation for survival. Fair enough. That's, yeah, okay. Sort of got the gist of that one before, I think. In contrast, psychological construction theories argue against the innateness of emotions. Interesting. These theories emphasize that the different types of emotions emerge from a construction process, that is, basic psychological operations such as perception. Oh, hold on a second, there's something here. Attention, I better give it attention. Maybe I need to bring in memory at this point to try and match to what that thing is. Combine to generate an emotional meaning that is influenced by social and linguistic factors. And you could see in one example, we perceive something, or attention goes to it maybe in the first instance, and then memory kicks in, and with that a word or what somebody told us about it. Oh, it's that object, it's crazy. What does that mean? This little animal's crazy? I mean, it's going to jump up and down? Or do we interpret that as crazy? It will attack us, and no matter what we do to it, it won't back off. It feels no pain. And so I think there's something in this sort of more construction process idea. I don't think it is one thing. I think that's one of the reasons that emotions are hard to tease apart, at least at the moment, in a way where we can get a consensus. So a particular psychological construction view, the conceptual act theory, CAT, claims that each emotional episode is built up by the brain from the combination of core affect, a representation of raw sensations related to the body. So we're getting back to some of those earlier ideas of, oh, it's this physiological thing. So this CAT, this conceptual act theory is saying, yeah, okay, let's take that into account, and then a categorization process based upon prior experience and mediated by conceptual and linguistic knowledge. So I've got that feeling. What was that like before? And how might we conceptualize this? Probably, I would suggest, connected to time and place and situation, and what have other people told us, but how are we labeling it as well? Then we go on. Semi-quantitative analysis enabled isolating different brain regions associated with different emotions. In particular, the processing of fear and sadness was associated with the activation of the amygdala. No doubt I heard of that, and particularly in relation to fear, and cingulate cortex, respectively. So fear, amygdala, sadness, cingulate cortex, while joy and disgust were associated with increased metabolic activity in the basal ganglia. Conversely, the mesio-prefrontal cortex was generally and extensively involved in all the emotions studied. These results were partly confirmed by a subsequent meta-analysis of 106 PET scans and fMRI studies. The authors found that specific brain regions were activated for fear, amygdala, disgust, insula and globus pallidus, and anger, lateral orbital frontal cortex, and reported activations in the cingulate cortex for fear and in part for joy. So what have we got? We've got these models that suggest that it's something to do with psychology, it's something to do with physiology. We've got brain regions that seem to be active depending on what emotion it is, but we're not aware of that, are we? We're just aware pretty much of the emotion. And most of us are able to label those emotions, but not everyone. But what does an emotion do? Well, that's what I wanted to cover next. Okay, so what we're going to look at here is a really basic, I can't even call it a diagram of the brain because it isn't. It's one way to think about the various parts of the brain, but this is not as it is. I have to emphasize that. And it is, well, very much in very many different ways, a huge generalization. But I think that you might find the concept useful and valuable. For me, it's all about taking things, simplifying them enough that I can use them, or at least it gives me an idea that I can think more about. So what we have here, in terms of our little diagram, so to speak, are three parts of the brain. NC, neocortex, higher thought processes, the ability to do, let's say, math, or maths if you're in the UK, or mathematics, to construct complex things, and actually not so complex things, language, so on. Those higher thought processes. Here, the limbic system, a catch-all in this little drawing for our emotional processing. It's got to be there somewhere. There may be arguments about where it is and exactly the sequence of events, but it's got to be there. There has got to be something. How do we know what that emotion is? There's something going on. Whether it's an interpretation of some physiological feeling, affect, or it is a labeling process, just simply that, without much interpretation. But there's got to be something going on. And down here, fight or flight. You've heard of this before, no doubt. Survival. Pure, unadulterated survival. Very, very, very simple processing. So in one way, we could consider it to be complex thinking, subtle, nuanced, more basic, a little bit more them and us. Tribal would be another way to think about it. So there's thinking, but it's not as sophisticated as the neocortex. And down here, fight or flight, well, that is, as I've suggested, the most basic of all, survival. Now, there are exceptions and, again, differences of opinion about exactly what's going on here. But for the moment, if you could stick with me on this, you might find this version to be useful, at least in some ways. Because if we then think about that, well, let's say a stimulus comes in, or stimuli, and it's going to be processed somewhere, isn't it? And we heard about the thalamus collecting information and promulgating it. But this limbic system, well, I'm going to go here with it first. Why? Because in that limbic system is the aforementioned amygdala. And for us to get frightened immediately and maybe kick into fight or flight, I suggest, I'm not the only one, that something's going to happen here first. Or at least, if it's being processed simultaneously between the limbic and the neocortex, this is going to be faster in terms of an output. Because if we're up here still processing, going, was that actually someone who needs to be rescued, or that I need to run away from, or whatever? If we're too busy thinking about that, hey, what label of jacket is that person wearing? No, that's no good. We've got to process it fast here and decide whether the big red alarm button gets pressed, and boom, we're in a fight or flight. And so I suggest here, maybe simultaneous processing, but this is fast and it's going to go here. Something that is a terrifying event, or we really, really need to get away from, or perhaps even run towards to save someone, that's going to happen quite quickly. And so the subtle thinking is doused down, diminished, maybe even to a degree almost totally evaporated. And I mentioned the amygdala before. Some studies suggest that part of the brain up here, the neocortex, that ability to solve complex issues, puzzles, construct things, etc., that, well, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is part of the executive suite up here, it is doused down. It is less active when the amygdala here becomes active. It's almost like a dimmer switch, and this being lit up, and the reverse is true. And this amygdala isn't as active, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is. And there's much more than that. And that could mean different things. Maybe the interpretation of that is wrong, but it seems compelling, doesn't it? That as this emotional center, certainly as far as the amygdala and fear is concerned, is lit up, something up here, which is more subtle in terms of processing, is diminished, reduced, doused down. And so, then what am I getting at? Well, what I'm getting at is this. When something comes here, and as I've suggested, there's got to be a label attached to it, we need to know what the label is. Sometimes, probably most of the time. Sometimes we might just find that it's such a threat, we're doing something without even really thinking about it at all. But most of the stuff that you and I face most of the time, thank goodness, tends not to be a life or death situation. I know it is for some people, but for us, the lucky ones, it isn't. It can happen, but most days it's not. It's something here. Maybe it's a social threat, a clique over there, a sneer, or perhaps a bill that comes in. You know, we open it and think, can we pay that? And so there's something going on. Yes, physiologically, and also I would suggest psychologically, because we're labeling what that is. Oh, that person in that group of colleagues over there, they looked and glanced away, they're talking to each other. So this is a social threat. Now, we're probably not going to go into fight or flight, but certainly we may feel that physiologically. Maybe our heart rate goes up, maybe we feel a bit of stiffness in our neck or pain in our back or whatever. And so we are aware of this emotion, but we also need to be aware of the context of it and what that person did. So there is neocortical processing as well. Are you with me so far? Because to have the stimulus come in, oh, those people looked towards me and started talking to one another, then we're feeling something with this emotional processing happening. But up here, we're also aware that, well, yeah, they looked and they turned away, and there's no other reason that I can see in the environment for them doing that beyond maybe it's to do with talking about me. Maybe it was that meeting last week. Maybe I shouldn't have said what I said, and so on. And a different process can go on. This is where that constructed theory comes in, this construction of things with memory and linguistics and situation. But again, let's keep it straightforward. So when this happens, when we have this processing here and here, yes, remember, fight or flight kind of wipes everything out, but for most of us, it's a dance between here and here. Then there will be a point where between us labeling it as, oh, well, it's just something I'm talking about. Oh, I don't know, I feel really bad about this. Physiology is all changing and churning up. And then maybe that causes us to think more negatively about it up here, to say to ourselves, oh my gosh, they are talking about me. And then the emotion stirs up, and maybe it gets strong enough that we walk up and say, hey, you talking about me again? What are you doing? Why are you talking about me? What is going on? And so what we see there is this tipping point. So let's draw it up here. Imagine that we're okay up until this point here. So this might be a bit of interest. What's going on? Intrigue, just unsure, almost irritation, mild irritation, definitely irritation at this crowd over here looking at me in that way, and then bang, at this point, anger. Whoom, we're over. As we creep up there, we can ratchet that back down again. Think of a roller coaster perhaps. When it hits here, well, the brakes aren't very good. It's almost impossible to switch off. We may, in fact, be in fight or flight. That's another way that can happen. But I'm talking here specifically for our example, that this is a strong overpowering. We're still thinking, because we can still articulate, but our thinking here, remember, it's more them and us. It's quite binary. It's not as subtle and nuanced as here. So, why then am I suggesting that this is useful to know? Because this point here, before we reach that tipping point and we go whoom, over the edge of the roller coaster and it's free fall of emotions and language, and as I've suggested, maybe it is fight or flight, but for most of us, most of the time, that's the exception. It's here, it's emotional thinking. And remember what I've said before, strong emotions dumb us down. They make us dumber. We don't think of different explanations for the crowd talking in the corner. Maybe it's nothing to do with us at all, but it can become that cycle, this loop, this little frenzy feeding itself to enhancing the emotions as we say, oh no, it's definitely us. Oh, that makes me feel even worse. Oh, I'm really annoyed at this point. Oh, I'm irritated. Oh, I'm angry. Or I'm fearful, or whatever. So there is a body of work which suggests that when we name the emotion, when we label the emotion, it can take the sting out of the emotion. Labeling it, it is suggested, helps lock in, activate the neocortex, our more rational thinking, subtle, wider, lateral. And naming it also, because of that labeling, probably because of one of those construction type models, allows us to begin to process this in a different way. So if we're labeling it, it's like saying, oh yeah, I get that, yeah, that feeling, I know it's there, but I've told you that is just that irritation that you're feeling is simply irritation. And let's maybe conceptualize why it may be happening. What are you feeling? What could be going wrong? How might you be misinterpreting that? And so with this dance between these two parts of the brain, if we do it correctly, if we do it in a way that works for us, we can gradually diminish this limbic system, and the neocortex is more in control. Consider this in some ways, it's not exactly this, but consider this in some ways as bottom up control. In other words, this is trying to hijack, whereas this is top down, to be more subtle, to be more nuanced, to be more considered, to be more logical. And by naming the emotion, we can stop it overpowering. We can stop it creeping further up and begin to douse it down. And then we can use other strategies like breathing or getting outside if at all possible, or even some of those ideas borrowed from things like cognitive behavioral therapy. What else could be going on here? You can't do any of that stuff, by the way, if you're teetering at the edge of heading down the slope on the roller coaster, because the cognition involved in thinking of those different ideas, different ways of considering a situation is diminished, it's doused down. Very, very difficult to do. That's why in a lot of therapy it is useful to get people a bit calmer if at all possible, so that we can allow that neocortex to do its work. And so there is one thing more that I want to add to that, in that some studies, one in particular, suggests that labeling the emotion doesn't always take the sting out of it. It partly depends how it's done. And when you then get on to labeling it and then thinking about maybe alternative explanations for what's going on, well, that sometimes doesn't work. According to one study that I've seen, a lot of other studies suggest it does work. But I think that with a study that says it doesn't work, my suspicion is it's partly to do with methodology. And with all these studies in laboratory, inverted commas, type conditions, they're not the same as real life, real time. So what I can tell you is anecdotally that I've talked to people about regarding this strategy of naming emotions, it seems to be successful. But it's not successful once we're overpowered. Once we're kind of here or thereabouts, and definitely on that side, doesn't work. Well, at least it doesn't work for me. Doesn't work for people that I've talked to. But what it does do on this side is it can allow you to have more of a conversation and to keep that cognition going, to keep that executive suite going. And it's at this point when you begin to name it and say to yourself, oh, that's a bit of irritation. What was the bigger picture here? Yeah. I don't want to be on the other side of that roller coaster slope. I want to be professional. I want to be dignified. I want to hopefully make friends rather than fall out. I, longer term, want to maybe do business with these people or get the CEO's job, whatever works for you. And because we're staying up here more than here, we're more in that considered type of thinking rather than that more black and white them and us thinking, then that is easier to do, and it becomes a sort of virtuous cycle, so to speak, and we can then walk away and calm down, or even consider that maybe there's a different approach that we could have taken and we will do next time. In other words, we're totally into cognition because the emotions have dissipated and just drifted away, evaporated, so to speak. So it can be done. And for me, very often it starts with irritation. Oh, a bit mildly irritated here. And it's hard to define where it is, but it's somewhere in that abdominal area for me. It's just a bit of irritation. And sometimes I don't bother and I get very irritated. But when I do think about the bigger picture and consider metaphorically taking a step back, sometimes physically taking a step back and saying, hey, what's the outcome I want here? Very often I can absolutely not overreact. I can react. Well, actually, we'll use that word. I can respond in a way that is more likely to give me the outcome or outcomes that I want. Anyway, let me know what you think. I hope at least it made some sense. And for the moment from me, bye for now.